Hello, my name is Dr. John Naranja. I'm an attorney at the Diller Law firm. We've had a number of clients who sustained pelvic injuries, and there are a lot of questions about what happens with pelvic injuries and what are they in reality. So what I'd like to do today is talk about pelvic injuries in broad respects and then try and help you understand what's involved. So in order to understand pelvic injuries, it's important to understand the anatomy of the pelvis. We're going to start really with the bony part of the pelvis because that's what houses some important structures. So if we take a look at both the front view of the pelvis, after all the muscle and skin has been removed, that's what's represented here. If we look at the back view of the pelvis, this is actually represented here. The green tinged colored bone is called the sacrum and coccyx. The ilium is this more yellowish structure here. If we look at the pubis, that's this pinkish structure. And this lavender structure is the ischium, as well as the pubic symphysis here, and also the acetabulum located on each side. The acetabulum is what houses the ball and socket joint of the hip. If we now take a look at the different types of fractures that occur about the hip, I'm going to first start with fractures that typically are quite stable, meaning they don't often require surgery unless there's some other vascular or blood vessel injury or there's a nerve injury. So what we're looking at here is, again, now is the front of the pelvis. The ilium, or when you put your hands on your hip, that's another term for the ilium, is located here. The tailbone or the sacrum and coccyx is located here. And on this side of the ilium, what we can see is there's a fracture of what's called the iliac wing. This typically, again, is very stable and unlikely to require any kind of intervention, partly because there are a lot of muscles that attach here, and that provides a lot of stability to the fracture. Another type of fracture that can occur is through what are called the inferior and superior pubic rami of the pelvis. And again, the superior ramus is located here. This is the inferior ramus, the area kind of where you sit on your butt. And crack or fracture is sustained in this area. These are, again, quite stable, meaning they won't tend to shift quite a bit, so they can be often treated non-operatively. Then the last type of fracture that I'll discuss in terms of the non-operative types of fractures are the sacral fractures. And here, the sacral fracture is located at what's called sacral ala, A-L-A. And again, those are quite stable and often don't need any type of surgical intervention. Now what we're going to talk about are acetabular fractures, which are actually quite significant because remember, the acetabulum, or the socket for the ball and socket joint of the hip, is where we bear weight when we walk. And when we walk, if the acetabulum has been fractured, what can happen if that is not stabilized is that the ball and socket joint can actually push through that socket and into the inside of the pelvis. So it's important to understand the type of injury and fracture pattern that occurs with any type of acetabular or pelvic acetabular fracture. Here's an example of the normal pelvis. You can see that the ball part of the ball and socket joint inserts into the acetabulum just below the ilium and next to the ischium and the ilium. And so when we look at the fracture pattern, there are different extents and different types of fracture patterns. And typically, this is evaluated through what's called a CT scan so that you can actually take images of the inside of the acetabulum to determine what kind of fracture has occurred. Again, these are important and oftentimes require surgical intervention to stabilize the hip or stabilize the socket so that the ball of the femoral head will not get displaced or dislocated. The final type of pelvic fracture that I'd like to discuss is when there's a compression or a force that's applied to the whole pelvis itself. The first type that we're looking at here, where my arrow is pointing, is what's called a lateral compression, meaning that each side of the pelvis gets pushed in and causes this compression. This can often happen in construction type injuries in which some heavy material gets pushed on to the side of the pelvis, and on the other side is the hard ground, so that you get this pushing motion of the ilium on one side getting pushed towards the ilium on the other side. And it's important to understand that the inside of the pelvis itself has important structures, important gastrointestinal, genitourinary, as well as blood vessels, so that if this type of compression occurs, damage can occur not only to the bones that we've already discussed, but also to the inside organs of the pelvis. Another type of compression that can occur is what's called a vertical shear injury. In this type of injury, what happens is half of the pelvis gets pushed upwards or towards the top, and the other half gets pushed downwards or towards the bottom. In this type of injury, the pelvis actually gets split in half, one up and then one towards the foot. In another type of injury, a windswept pelvis, in which there are rotatory forces both on the inside and the outside of the pelvis, causing almost a dislocation of the inside portion or the side portion of the pelvis from the remainder part of it. An AP compression of the pelvis can also cause what's called an open book, meaning instead of compressing each side of the pelvis together, the pelvis can actually be opened up in an area where the pelvis is actually spread apart, and the injury is more likely to be located in the inner parts of that pelvis. In order to further understand the inner parts of the pelvis and what can be injured, we look next at the really broad extent of blood vessels that is involved with the pelvis. You can understand that when someone sustains a pelvic type of injury or pelvic fracture, important things to consider is the extent of blood loss. As you can see here, these are the main parts of the aorta or the arteries that extend down as they go through down into the leg, and then extend with further branches into the pelvis and hip itself. What we're looking at here is that when someone sustains, for example, an open book pelvis, in which one side of the pelvis is spread externally and the other side is spread to the other side externally, what happens is this creates what might consider an open book, meaning if the sacrum itself were a hinge and the opening of the book were located where my arrow is, it would open up the pelvis one side to the other. When that occurs, again, thinking about all the blood vessels that occur that are located or situated within the pelvis, significant bleeding can occur. When that type of situation occurs, this is what's called an external pelvic fixator or a pelvic external fixator. What happens here is that screws are placed into the ilium, or the same place where you put your hands on your hips, and then the outer portion here is almost like an erector set. These bars are then closed and compressed together to try and close the book that was once open back into its normal location. When that occurs, that leads to less traction on the blood vessels and can help stop heavy bleeding until they can be exactly located and treated. These next two slides, basically, I want to show the pelvic contents in terms of their soft tissues. What we're seeing here is if we opened up the pelvis and look inside, we can see that there is the ending portion of the gastrointestinal tract, which includes the rectum. In the female anatomy, this is where also the uterus is located, and then where the bladder is located. If we then convert this now to the male pelvis, we can see again the gastrointestinal tract, we can see the bladder, and then we can see the reproductive organs that can be also injured significantly with pelvic fractures and pelvic injuries. With respect to pelvic injuries, this particular topic was discussed more with a focus on the bony injuries, but as you can see, pelvic injuries themselves can be an indication of also soft tissue injuries of both the gastrointestinal tract, the reproductive tracts, as well as the urinary tract. Thank you for your attention.